I'm going to be talking about the structure and function of the human heart, and it's in the grade 10 syllabus. I'm going to pay particular attention to the language of science that we use in teaching, and hopefully you will be able to understand the language of science so you can understand the content of the structure of the heart and its functions. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to label the different parts of the heart, and to be able to also to give the functions of the different parts of the heart, and also to be able to relate the structure of the heart to its function. In other words, you should be able to say how different parts of the heart are structurally suited for its function. What we're going to see in the first diagram is a very simple representation of the heart. It's basically a circle, and what I've got in this circle is that I've divided the circle up into 4 compartments, as you can see. And in these 4 compartments, you'll see that on the right hand side of this, where I've got, it's called the right atrium and the right ventricle, it's colored blue, and the left atrium and the left ventricle is colored red. This is to denote deoxygenated blood. The blue denotes deoxygenated blood, which I'll explain just now, and the red denotes oxygenated blood, which I'll talk about just now. So let's talk about this. The first circle on the outside is the pericardium. Peri comes from the word, perimeter, so it is the outermost covering, and cardiac refers to the heart. So the pericardium is this tough membrane that protects the heart. And dividing the left and the right side of the heart is cardiac muscle tissue, and this is called the septum. And the septum has this very important function of being able to enable that the deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood do not mix, and that's very important for the function that you'll learn in your next lesson. So I want to orientate this diagram for you firstly and tell you that although you see on your diagram the right atrium and ventricle appears on the left side, and the left atrium and left ventricle appear on the right hand side, it's because of the fact that this represents the frontal view of the heart, and as it is situated in the chest of the person. So just remember that when you are looking at a diagram of the heart. Let's talk about what is deoxygenated blood and what is oxygenated blood. Well, oxygenated blood comes from the word oxygen, which means that this is blood that contains a high level of oxygen, and of course therefore a low amount of carbon dioxide. Whereas deoxygenated blood, D means without, so deoxygenated blood actually contains a low amount of oxygen and a high amount of carbon dioxide. And as I mentioned before, the heart is divided into 4 chambers, like you can see in the diagram, and that is the right and left atrium and the right and left ventricle. Now, let's talk about the derivation of the word atrium. An atrium is a chamber. Okay, so it's a very good name for a chamber. So the upper region of the heart, which is the right atrium and the left atrium, receives blood. Actually, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood, and the left atrium receives oxygenated blood. The 2 lower chambers of the heart are called ventricles, and ventricles are cavities that are found within organs. That's the derivation of the word ventricle. And you would notice later, you will see that the ventricles have thicker muscular walls compared to the 2 atria, which is the plural of atrium. And we'll explain why that is important later. Now, the right ventricle receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium, and the left ventricle receives oxygenated blood from the left atrium. I'll repeat that later when I look at the proper structure of the heart. So let's look at the diagram of the heart and its associated blood vessels. And if you look at the diagram very carefully, I'm going to talk to that diagram, and I'm going to say to you that there's 4 chambers like we discussed in the diagrammatic view just now. And now remind you, it's the 2 atria, okay, the right atrium and the left atrium, and then the 2 ventricles below that, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And remember, I've mentioned already that the right-hand side of the heart, the right atrium and the right ventricle, is colored blue to make it easy for you to understand that it deals with deoxygenated blood. And the left side of the heart is colored red to make it easy for you to understand that it deals with oxygenated blood. And the septum is clearly indicated to you. That's a septum which is made up of cardiac muscle that actually separates the right and left half of the heart, so that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood does not mix. Then if you follow, there's 2 blood vessels that bring in deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. They are called superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Now, the superior and inferior does not refer to that one blood vessel is better than the other. Superior refers to position, and position has to do with the fact that the superior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the upper part of the body. That is your head, your neck, your arms and your chest. Whereas the inferior vena cava, which is below it, brings deoxygenated blood from the veins of the lower parts of your body, your abdomen, your legs and your pelvis. So don't think that superior and inferior means that one blood vessel is better than the other. And if you look at the right side of the heart again, you will see that between the right atrium and the right ventricle there is a valve. And this valve is called, appropriately, atrioventricular valve. Can you see that it's from atrium and from ventricle? And in particular, this valve on the right-hand side is called the tricuspid valve. It's given a specific name. And all it means is that tri means 3. So it has 3 cusps or flaps. And these cusps or flaps, okay, form this valve. And a valve is nothing more than a structure, in this case in the heart, that allows liquid, in this case blood, to flow in one direction only. So that's what a valve does. Okay, and the tricuspid valve, and it's a nice way to remember that this is called the tricuspid valve because there's an R in tricuspid, and you can think of it as from the right-hand side. Okay, and this valve then allows blood to flow from the right atrium after the right atrium has received deoxygenated blood from all parts of the body. It allows the blood flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And this is a one way, one direction only. The valve only allows one directional flow of blood. And when the right ventricle contracts to pump blood to the lungs, which is nearby, these valves close up. And when it closes up, it prevents blood flow from the ventricle back into the atrium, which is important. And this blood flow then is blood flow goes from the right ventricle to the lungs, which are nearby. Now, these valves do not collapse because the valve is held in position by tendons, which we call chordae tendineae. Can you see tendons tendineae. That's where it comes from. And these are strings that keeps the valve in position so that it does not go inside out. So the valve does not allow blood flow back into the atrium. Now, contraction of the right ventricle, as I said just now, pushes deoxygenated blood via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Now, very interesting to note that, normally we have learned that veins carry deoxygenated blood and arteries carry oxygenated blood. This is an exception in the human body where the pulmonary artery transports deoxygenated blood. So this is the only artery, therefore, in the human body that transports deoxygenated blood. Now, the pulmonary artery has valves in it as well, and these are called semilunar valves. Now, if you look at the word semi, it means half, okay? And lunar comes from the word moon, so it's half moon-shaped valves. And as you can imagine, if you look at half moon, you will see that's the shape of these valves. Now, these valves are very important in the pulmonary artery and actually also in the pulmonary vein and the aorta, because they prevent the backflow of blood into the right ventricle when the right ventricle stops contracting. So very important function of these semilunar valves. Now, if we look at the left side of the heart, and I will remind you that the left side of the heart deals with oxygenated blood, hence cement colored blue. And if you look at the pulmonary veins that come into the right atrium, these pulmonary veins bring in oxygenated blood from the lungs into the left atrium. And of course, I'll remind you again, the pulmonary vein is the only vein in the body that transports oxygenated blood. Normally veins transport deoxygenated blood. Now, there's a valve, like we discussed in the right side of the heart. There's a valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And it is also an atrioventricular valve, from the words atrium and ventricle. But on the left-hand side, this valve is given a specific name. It's called a bicuspid valve. And as you know, bi means two. So this valve has two cusps or two flaps. And what does this valve do? It allows blood to flow from the oxygenated blood to flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And then this valve then closes when the ventricle contracts, so that there is no blood flow back into the left atrium. And again, like I discussed earlier, on the right-hand side of the heart, the valve is held in place by chordae tendineae, which are tendons that prevent these two flaps that makes up the bicuspid valve from turning inside out. When the ventricle contracts, when the left ventricle contracts, let's talk about that first, it pumps out oxygenated blood via the aorta to all systems of the body. And the aorta, I'll remind you, also has semilunar valves, because it must prevent the backflow of blood into the ventricle when the ventricle stops contracting. Now, if you look at the diagram and if you look at the muscular walls that make up the ventricles, you will see that the ventricles have a thicker muscular wall compared to the atria. If you look at the atria, they have thin walls. And there's a very good reason for this. In fact, the heart is a great pump, actually. The reason is that when the atria contracts, it only has to pump blood a very short distance from the atria into the ventricles, which are just below it, and gravity also is able to help. So therefore, atria do not need to have thick muscular walls. It makes sense, right? And also, if you look at the difference in the muscular walls of the ventricles below, notice something, that the left ventricle has thicker muscular walls than the right ventricle. And look at the diagram carefully and you'll see that. And this is also, there's a great reason for that. The right ventricle pumps blood nearby to the lungs, which are alongside the heart. Right? So it does not need to have very strong muscles. Whereas, and by the way, this is called the pulmonary circulation of blood. And anytime you look at the word pulmonary, you must understand that this refers to the lungs. So the pulmonary circulation of blood refers to the blood that circulates between the heart and the lungs. So the right ventricle then pumps blood to the nearby lungs, so it does not have to be very thick, it does not have to have very thick muscular walls. Whereas the left ventricle, on the other hand, can you see that it has very thick muscular walls if you look at the diagram? And it has to be more powerful because when it contracts, it has to pump blood to all parts of the body. Okay, to your legs, to your toes, and everything, to your head as well. So this is called the systemic circulation of blood. So it pumps blood to all the systems of the body. So obviously it has to have more power, and the more power is got by the thicker muscular walls. So hopefully you've understood this. You can label the heart. You know the functions of each parts of the heart from what I've just discussed. And hopefully you can answer some of the questions that I'm going to present in a little assessment task to help you to make sure that you've understood this. If you look at the diagram of my little informal assessment that you need to look at, you will see that I've got the heart, the same heart that we've looked at and we studied the structure, the functions. But now instead of having labels, I've got letters of the alphabet there. And I ask the following questions. Give the labels of the following parts. And I refer to G. And if you look at G, you're looking at the right atrium. J refers to the aorta. If you look at A refers to the pulmonary veins bringing in oxygenated blood in. And if you look at I refers to the superior vena cava. The next question that I ask is state one function of the following, and I'm sure you can write this down. The function of the semilunar valves, the function, that's H, the function of D, and if you look at what D represents, it represents the septum. What's the function of D? Okay, and then what is the function of K? And K refers to the blood vessel, that is the pulmonary arteries. Then I asked to tabulate two differences in composition between the blood found in E, which is your right ventricle, and the blood found in part C, which is your left ventricle. Sure, you could do that. The color can help you out there. And then the last question is what I've discussed with you earlier on, so it should not be difficult for you to answer this question. Explain why the left ventricle has thicker muscular walls when compared to the right ventricle. Okay, easy test. I'm sure you'll do very well in it, and thank you very much for listening.